I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day. His name is Juan Sebastian Gonzalez. He is Special Advisor to President Biden. He's the Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council. Good morning, Juan.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm just going to wait for a moment. It's a true pleasure to have you here. There we are. The audience can see you now, and I can see you. It is great to see you. And I am sorry that you couldn't be here with us, but we understand why. Pressing matters to attend to in Washington.
Yeah, I'm also sorry that I wasn't able to make it, but obviously everybody sees the news from Monday and Tuesday, and we are just getting started in terms of the level of ambition that we are really trying to bring to the Summit of the Americas. But when that happens, the senior director has to stay in Washington, so sorry to miss you all.
Well, let me pick up on that point, Juan. What Latin America wants, I think it's fair to say, from the Biden administration is a set of policies that will do for this region what the embrace of China and Southeast Asia more broadly did for that part of the world over the last 30 years. And I'm talking about growth, I'm talking about jobs, I'm talking about prosperity, and I'm talking about increasingly diversified economies. Tell us, do such policies exist inside the Biden administration?
The question is whether those policies exist within the region, right? And I'm sure this has been covered by experts, but if you look at some of the core challenges, they are, one, inequality in a region where there's a high concentration of political and economic power, dependence on commodities when the world is going through a full transition, and weakness in education, where there's a challenge in deploying human capital. And the impact of the pandemic is something that has elevated some challenges that the graph clearly shows predated the pandemic and is the reason that people were protesting. Now, the question for the United States is that at a time when, throughout our history, when there's been conflicts in other parts of the world have led to a realignment of US policy toward the Americas, the focus on stability in the region and this consensus in favor of democracy has allowed us to organize and shape the world, because there aren't wars and conflicts in the Western Hemisphere as there are in other places. And we've taken different approaches throughout the years, right? You have the good neighbor policy, the Alliance for Progress, obviously the Cold War, but we don't really like to talk about that part. But the question is, at a similar inflection point as the president sees it, how is the United States going to shape global dynamics to advance our national security interests and ensure that the governments are delivering for democracy everywhere? And I'll finish the answer to your question here. For the president, fundamentally, it is in two parts, and we can talk about the specifics. The first is that the hemisphere's democratic self-determination is one that is in the national security interest of the United States. He says it's not our backyard, it's not our front yard. They're our partners, and they have more implications to our economic well-being and security than other regions in the world. And the other is that, just like in the 1994 summit, the free trade agenda informed 28 years of US foreign policy in the Americas. The question now is, what is the next step? And how do we build on top of these free trade agreements to make sure that we're not just focused on economic growth, but on equity of outcomes and opportunity, making sure that democracies are delivering, that governments are being responsive to their citizenry. And that's really going to be at the core of the conversation we're going to have in June in Los Angeles.
Well, let's talk about some of those next steps. Joe Biden has been the United States president for almost 1.5 years, yet many of the policies that the Trump administration imposed on Latin America remain in place 1.5 years later. How come?
Well, that has changed. Of course, we look, I'll say on Cuba specifically, the July 11th protests of last year had an impact. Somebody who started out in the civil rights movement, was in the Senate, a lead critic of apartheid in South Africa. For him, the issues of human rights are at the core of what he believes. Also, the treatment of Venezuelans by the regime, the crackdown in Nicaragua, and the closure of the democratic space are things that are central to who he is as a person, but also one that he recognizes have implications for the United States and for the region. And so he, directed us to engage with the community, to work with Congress, to undertake this Cuba policy review that he wanted to roll out before the Summit of the Americas, to put forward a view to these specific countries that did three things. Number one, supported dialogue as a way forward. And certainly peaceful negotiated outcome to the Venezuelan crisis is something that we support. Number two is we see dialogue with Cuba not as a reward, but as a way to advance our national security interests. There also, step two is we have to take steps that are in our interest or that really try to support the people of these countries. So his policy on Cuba is hard on the regime, but soft on the people. And that's why we took steps to eliminate prohibitions on travel, provide remittances, and so on. But the last one is on no compromises on matters of human rights. We've continued to sanction individuals, go after criminal actors, pursue the ill-gotten gains from Venezuela, from Cuba, but also sanction individuals in Nicaragua. And that is a coherent approach that is really looking at building an international consensus in favor of change. Those have been, I think, the core changes. But as we look at the summit, we're also thinking about new frameworks and tools to address a lot of the economic issues that you laid out.
Since you brought up Venezuela, Juan, I'm going to go right there. President Cortizo told us yesterday here in Panama that the sectoral sanctions on the Venezuelan economy are doing nothing but hurting the Venezuelan people, and they should be eased or lifted altogether. And Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, now the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, told us the very same thing. Why are those sanctions still in force given the misery and the suffering that they have brought to ordinary Venezuelans? And I should add, without one sign or suggestion of regime change.
Yeah, so I would take issue with that characterization in the sense that it was the mismanagement of the economy that has brought Venezuela down, one of the previously greatest economies, the breadbasket of South America. And the sanctions, which were put in place by the previous administration, were certainly focused on regime change. What we are focused on here, and the president has laid out very clearly, the Secretary of State, is that our policy framework with regard to Venezuela is simple. If there is a negotiated outcome that leads to ambitious, irreversible, and concrete steps toward free and fair elections, the European Union has issued a report. It's very clear what needs to happen. Then the United States and the international community will alleviate pressure. The opposite is true. If they walk away from the talks, if there is a further crackdown, the UN has also found a concerning record of extrajudicial killings. There's been a closure of the democratic space. So if we're going to have a conversation about Venezuela, we should talk about what is the way forward that can empower Venezuelans to actually be the ones that determine their own future. And the focus of the international community should be on the negotiating table and on outcomes that really lead to the alleviation of pressure as an incentive.
So, forgive me, I know you took issue with the premise of my question, but I'll take issue with the premise of your answer. The sanctions are having an impact on the Venezuelan economy. That's undeniable. We can debate the degree to which they are, but they are. And so, what I take from what you've just told us is that until you see some sign of a free and fair election in Venezuela, regardless of how miserable life may be for ordinary Venezuelans, those sectoral sanctions will remain in place. Is that correct?
What I would say is the unilateral lifting of sanctions on Venezuela is not going to improve the lives of Venezuelans. There's still a lot of people in Venezuela that are wealthy, that are going to shopping malls, that are doing very well. But for normal Venezuelans, if you get outside of Caracas and even inside Caracas, the lifting of sanctions is only going to line the pockets of the regime. And so we need to, has to be accompanied by concrete steps. And I'm not talking about regime change. I'm talking about clear steps that level the electoral playing field, the release of political prisoners, the validation of political parties. There is wide reporting on steps that are practical, that advance the ball in terms of democratic freedoms in Venezuela, and that it is what should be the focus of the international community to try to incentivize and to support.
Thank you. That makes things much clearer. As you're well aware, there's a great deal of focus at the moment on the potential for Venezuela to supply the global oil market with more crude. What, if anything, is the Biden administration prepared to do to increase the flow of that precious commodity to the global oil market and to Europe in particular, which is increasingly starved for energy?
Well, look, you're seeing the focus of our policy moves on Venezuela are 100% focused on trying to promote a democratic outcome. And we continue to stand behind those Venezuelans who want democracy. That is really the focus. It is not about how do you actually shape the oil market, because as folks know better than I do, to lift sectoral sanctions on Venezuela tomorrow are not going to really change the global price of oil. But there are measures. Eni and Repsol are able to continue their ongoing gas production. They're now just able to get paid in oil for it, and we're taking oil off of the black market that the regime is currently selling. But again, the question really is the regime ready to take steps that Venezuelans want to expand the democratic space? And it is very clear, we have made more than clear that we will act on the basis of the ambition of the outcome. The bigger the outcome, the bigger the alleviation of the sanction, but a step back will mean a reimposing of those sanctions.
You mentioned Eni and Repsol specifically. Would you like to see Chevron resume operations in Venezuela?
I would like the regime to start opening the democratic space. So I don't think about this in terms of oil, frankly. I know that Bloomberg is looking at the economic outcomes, but I think that the best thing for Venezuela, the best thing for markets, and frankly, the best thing for the region is for the regime to start taking steps to open up the democratic space. And on the basis of that, everything else is resolved.
You have mentioned, Juan, on more than one occasion in this conversation, the upcoming Summit of the Americas that the United States is hosting in Los Angeles next month. And I know that you have lofty objectives for that gathering, but many people wonder what you can accomplish and, frankly, how you'll define success at that gathering when the two biggest and most powerful countries in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico, won't be there. Well, that's not necessarily true that they won't be there. I know there's been a lot of intrigue, and that is usually what characterizes the Summit of the Americas. But I would say wait to see who shows up on June 8th. But I think that in terms of the agenda itself, I think kind of to my opening point, the free trade agenda we've had has served us well and has led to prosperity and to integration. But given the underlying challenges of the region, we need to think about new frameworks and tools. Some of those are, for example, Latin America is a region that is middle and middle-high income. And so therefore, a lot of the tools for debt forgiveness, for COVID response that have come out of the G20 space, the World Bank and the IMF, have not benefited countries, for example, like Colombia, that are doing everything right to manage their economy and are still suffering from the impact of the pandemic and the influx of Venezuelan migrants. So we have to develop new tools, even I think concessional and grant mechanisms for countries that are taking what are sometimes politically difficult steps to address some of the structural challenges that they're facing. You saw Duque try to pass a tax reform that all analysts said was the right thing to do and was met with protest. So how do you actually create the tools and incentives that lower the political cost around those sorts of decisions? The other is, just briefly, is on economic frameworks. Sure, more trade is an important tool of integration, but we have more trade agreements with Latin America and the Caribbean than other regions of the world. How are we taking advantage of those to work very closely with the private sector to have roadmaps for the nearshoring and resilience of our supply chains, which the pandemic and tensions with China have shown are delicate, most of them. What else are we doing to make sure that we're expanding digital connectivity, the expansion of O-RAN technology, or even cloud-based 5G structures? What are we doing to also accelerate the transition to energy? Because China is investing in being the leader of the energy future. Latin America and the Caribbean remains incredibly dependent on commodities. How can we actually help by supporting transition fuels and climate fuels that will create economic, I think, self-sustainability tools for the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and ultimately benefit the United States? And so these are the questions and the conversations that we're having going into the summit. You dropped what seemed to me like a tantalizing hint. Were you suggesting that Mexican President Obrador or possibly Brazilian President Bolsonaro will actually come to the Summit of the Americas? You know, the number one rule of the NSC is don't make news, let the president make news. So I would say stay tuned. There are other countries, including Argentina, that say they may pull out unless the United States invites Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua to attend. How will you
Yeah,
respond?
what I would say in the conversations, the vice president met with the Caribbean community heads of state. We have been talking since last January with Argentina and with other countries. You know, the questions about Cuba's participation really detract from two sets of conversations. The questions about really what does it mean to for democracy to deliver? What does it mean to really have a common sense conversation on matters of human rights? And in Cuba, when minors are given 40-year sentences for singing in the streets and asking for change, we really need to ask ourselves: is that the conversation we want to have? Ultimately, these are conversations that we're going to have in collaboration with the countries of the region. We're not going to put down hard lines as the hosts. We want to have this conversation with them. But the conversations we are having with countries are also ones that move very quickly to what we want to get out of the summit. And most leaders of the region recognize that we are at an incredibly important moment where we can focus on the traditional issues of who shook whose hand, who gave who a book, who showed up, or are we ready as leaders to really tackle some of these challenges, galvanize and organize ourselves around an ambitious agenda, take steps to reform some of the international organizations of Bretton Woods and of regional development that have served us, but that today need to be updated to today's context. These are the conversations that everybody wants to have. And the Caribbean specifically, I'll say, and I'll give you a very specific example of some of these challenges that need to be worked through. A country like Barbados is considered graduated almost from World Bank categories. But tomorrow a hurricane could wipe out that entire country and it would still be considered a high-income country that would not have access to certain tools. That's something that really needs to have a fix. It has direct implications for the United States. We need to find ways to create not just financial tools, but a market that is focused on addressing issues in the Caribbean, issues of resilience, issues of adaptation need to be at the core of our policies. And these are the conversations that the Vice President has been leading in her conversations with Caribbean heads of state.
One last matter to raise with you. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is redrawing the geopolitical map. Finland and Sweden have applied to become members of NATO. It is also throwing the world's supply chains into even more chaos than they were before and contributing to alarming increases in inflation in the United States, in this region, and everywhere around the world. Where does Latin America fit into the U.S. trade and security strategy, in particular with respect to efforts to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I'm talking about nearshoring, securing commodity supplies, and I could add more to that list.
Exactly. Let me answer that by talking about migration, where sometimes the migration debate in the United States is about the border. But the way the president and the vice president see it is that people are moving in unprecedented levels because of inflation as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the breadbaskets of the world. That there aren't social safety nets in Latin America and the Caribbean that can address and help countries navigate some of these challenges. And so we need to look at all of these issues. And so what the kind of economic framework and economic agenda that we really want to come out with out of the summit, and started to have conversations with leaders about this, are specifically that. Not just the immediate steps to try to make sure that we're addressing the food security crisis, but also how do we prepare for the next one? So having clear dialogues and partnerships with the private sector to figure out what it takes for them to bring their supply chains home. What are we doing to ensure that there are policies in place and collaborations and dialogues with the private sector to ensure that we're creating the space to expand digital connectivity. We're already talking about assuming an equity stake in IDB Invest to further mobilize private capital, which during the pandemic, you saw that there was active mobilization of public lending, but the private lending in Latin America and the Caribbean was well below what it should have been. And finding ways to target that specifically to address some of these structural challenges that are the impact of the Russian invasion and obviously the pandemic. A lot of these have short and long-term challenges, but none of these, but all of them require a high level of political will for us to be able to address them effectively, because it's not a function of just US policy, it's a function of a shared agenda, a clear stake in what outcomes need to happen, investing political capital often and breaking through conventional norms to really drive toward outcomes that help make the Western Hemisphere one that, as the president likes to talk about, we should aspire to one that is secure, middle class, and democratic.
Juan Sebastian Gonzalez, I want to thank you personally and ask our audience to join me in thanking you for spending time with us at Bloomberg New Economy, Gateway Latin America.